Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health, I welcome each of you to today's webinar, First Nations Leadership on Climate Change, National and Regional Strategies of the Assembly of First Nations. My name is Roberta Stout, and I'm a research associate with the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health. Our centre is located at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, BC, on the homelands of the Kle-Kle-Tene First Nation. I am, however, zooming in today from Winnipeg in the beautiful Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis peoples. I will be facilitating today's webinar along with my colleague, Donna Atkinson. Very briefly, the NCCIH is one of 6 national collaborating centers for public health that was established in 2005 with funding through the Public Health Agency of Canada. Our sister NCCs are focused on specific topic areas, including infectious diseases, environmental health, healthy public policy, determinants of health, and methods and tools for knowledge translation. Our center supports health equity for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples by promoting Indigenous-informed evidence to transform practice, policy, and program decision-making across all sectors of public health. Today's Zoom webinar, just to give you a bit of background, all questions for the panelists as well as technical questions can be submitted in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Links to resources that are mentioned will be posted in the chat window. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the NCCIH website. And there may be brief pauses between our presenters. And if you do need live transcription, it is available at the bottom of your screen. In terms of the learning objectives for today, we're going to understand how First Nations conceptualize the impacts of and solutions to climate change, to recognize that climate change is a determinant of health for First Nations peoples, which impacts water and food security, infrastructure and safety, culture and land-based activities, and the transmission of knowledge between generations, just to name a few. As well, to explore First Nations climate leadership and discuss examples at the regional and national levels and opportunities on climate action at the regional, national, and international levels. I am very, very honored to have the following speakers attend this webinar to present to you today. They're from many regions of Canada, and they'll share an overview of the important work underway by the Assembly of First Nations at the national and regional levels. We will start by hearing from Jewel, Davies, and Shauna Yeomans-Lindstrom on the Yukon Climate Action Fellowship, or AFN Yukon. I would love if each of you could introduce yourselves in the way that you would like to, and then to proceed with your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here. Yekunisheen ka katuku yuchat duisachlinget kena dachloedi ayahat. My Tlingit names are Yekunisheen and Katuku, and I come from the Dachloedi Killer Whale Eagle clan. I am a member of the Carcross Tagish First Nation, and I have grown up in Teslin, Yukon my whole life, and I now reside in Whitehorse, Yukon, where I am a fellow on the Yukon First Nations Climate Action Fellowship. And I'm zooming in from Whitehorse on the lands of the Ta'an Quechan and as well as the Kwanlin Dun First Nations. So thank you, Ganeshish, and excited for our talks today.
Hello, good morning. My name is Shauna Yeomans-Lindstrom, and I'm from the Taku River Tlingit First Nation. I belong to the Yanyeti Wolf Clan of the Taku River, and I have been a land guardian for my First Nation since 2016. And before then, I was in early childhood education. And so I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to share a little bit about our fellowship. Okay.
So I think we're just going to introduce our film. We just have a quick 8-minute film to show you before we start our presentation.
We noticed that with a lot of First Nation kids, you know, they're so city oriented, you know, they lose themselves, eh? You know, and so we take them out on the land and away from everything, you know, and cell service and everything, eh? Now they can focus on themselves, you know, and okay, this is who I am, you know, and okay, this is my culture, you know, my spirituality, everything like that, you know, so. Let's keep passing on this, you know, reconnection, you know, it's very important. You were gifted with this, you know, let's not lose it, you know, so, yeah. Thank you.
I see the working with these young fellows as them making clear to me my role. Leadership doesn't end, and leadership is not dependent on having an elected or appointed title, but to walk with your people forward. And I don't carry an elected title or an appointed title, but I am privileged to walk with these leaders into their future. That is something that I'm very, very grateful for. I just see myself continuing long after this physical body is gone with the stories I hope are good stories, and that one of these young leaders is going to look back one day and say, I remember when she said that, and that's what helped us to get here. Working with these young fellows in their leadership journey is helping me write my own good story. They're going to tell a good story of me, I hope.
Hearing their traditional stories, realizing that I need to keep these traditions going. You know, with Etsuaku and my family, realizing I need to pass those traditions on, and I need to learn them myself. I feel like my whole life has changed, but it's changed for the better. I know what I want to do with my future, with my life. And like a year ago, I wasn't sure what I wanted to be doing, what I wanted to get into. The fellowship is like this huge support system, and yeah, it's great. I love it. The whole journey has been amazing.
I was definitely feeling a little bit reserved coming in, but once being here, it's like everything I gave, I got back in tenfold. It was so nice, like just feels like family and love, and just the feeling of the connection to the land. I was very appreciative of being able to go out on the boat with Shauna's partner Jared and just learn the land from a local. And like, you know, I think you could truly spend the rest of your life in this land and you'll never see every corner.
You're more in tune with the land, and like the deeper that connection with the land is, it's almost you can feel that the grief that the land is also going through, and that connection, and it's almost overwhelming when you're in a place like this where you're very disconnected and very grounded in the land, and then the idea of leaving this space is a little overwhelming, and it's really interesting to be able to go from one shift to the next shift so rapidly. But I think it's in spaces like these that we get to practice that mindfulness and practice strengthening the connection to the land.
For the last couple of years, I've really established what reconnection really means to me. Before this fellowship, I did go hunting and fishing every year. It wasn't my priority though. My priority was getting an education and getting a job and chasing that colonial sense of success. And then since then, it's been kind of a domino effect of me going out on the land, harvesting medicine, doing ceremony, learning the language, and really tying that back to understanding the land, not in that sense of like language, like understanding what's being said, but feeling what they want to say, like through ceremony and through understanding spirit and through stories, and really learning the sense of that land and where I come from. And so that's what led me into that, is I believe that language revitalization and cultural revitalization are hand in hand with the steps towards working towards my reconnection journey. And I advocate on that for future language learners and for land stewards.
What does reconnection mean to you? What does it mean, and what is the damage of being disconnected? And how can this journey of reconnection serve us going forward? It might be more through storytelling, intergenerational, just space and time together with the elders and like the children, and then all in between. And I actually think that's going to become a very important part of our process and journey. And it's something that we don't do in Western ways. We never take a second to step back in our work to say, hey, is this causing me like mental strain? Am I unwell and unbalanced because of my work commitments? And I really commend our fellows standing firm that self-care is, I think, actually like the #1 to do. To be whole and to ask others to be whole takes self-work, and it takes self-care. It's been a really amazing journey. We started in January of 2021, mostly with online spaces, and they have been going through this amazing journey of healing and reconnection. They've just formed such amazing friendships and really found a grounding and a passion for this work. It's incredibly inspiring to be around the fellows, and they truly give a sense of hope. It's very, very rewarding work.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so that video is actually filmed and created by one of our fellows, Jared Dulac, and as you can see, we are very lucky to have him. As well as our logo at the end there was actually beaded by another one of our fellows, Carissa Waugh. So yeah. So we could just move on to the next slide, please, and then the next one. And I'll just speak a little bit to the origin of the fellowship. So in February 2020, the first ever Yukon First Nations Climate Action Gathering was held at the Kwanlindang Cultural Center here in White Horse, Yukon. And at this gathering, the First Nations, the Yukon First Nations signed a climate change emergency declaration, which included the endorsement and the development of a Yukon First Nations climate action vision and action plan. It was also decided that this will be youth-led, as it is our futures at stake, and we will inherit the decisions that are being made today and now. This fellowship was designed to uphold 13 youth to reconnect with their culture and identity and develop this vision and action plan. We have been working, growing, and reconnecting together since January 2021. So, and I'll just move to the next slide, please. So we did begin in January 2021 in the midst of the pandemic. So we were only able to meet on Zoom for the first few months, but during those months, we really focused on building our spiritual and emotional foundations to work towards engaging in this climate action work as whole people. So looking at ourselves through the medicine wheel, fostering and building our relationships with not only our mental and our physical pieces of the medicine wheel, but also our spiritual and emotional. We had many guest speakers. We were lucky to have many amazing guest speakers and teachers, such as Dr. Lee Brown, who taught us about emotional competency, Dr. David McConville taught us a little bit about illuminating worldviews, Erin Matsariki-Carr, who spoke to Indigenous law, Lila June Johnson, who spoke to art and activism, and many more, as well as we're very lucky to have guiding elders such as Joe Copperjack, Mark Wedge, Shirley Adamson, and Norma Cassie, as well as many other elders that we've been very grateful to learn from over the past little while, here in a few months. I'll just pass it on to Shauna to speak a bit to our in-person gatherings and our time together.
Our first in-person gathering was last April, and
can we just switch the slides? Thank you.
Thank you. Our first in-person gathering was in April, and it was at Marsh Lake at a beautiful inn on the lake. And you'll see swans are really significant because in April, that's when the swans are coming back into the Yukon and stuff. And that was incorporated in our logo. And so our first gathering was really centered around storytelling and expression through art. And so it was really incredible being able to spend time with Darcy Tara McDermott. And we were able to really sit down and really absorb some stories from our elder Shirley Adamson. And then we were later able to go on into a discussion about, how we often get messages from the land, the animals, but also our dreams, and how we should start paying attention to our dreams. And it was really cool being exposed to Darcy and her beautiful art, because one of her things is she paints a lot of her dreams. And so there's a lot of stories and messages behind that. And so it's really amazing. The next gathering we had was we also had one of the really cool significant things about our first gathering too. One of our fellows mentioned while we were sitting in front of a fire all together one evening, one day we're all going to be elders and we're going to be sitting around a fire together. And the whole entire sky lit up with northern lights, and it was a really powerful moment for all of us because it felt like we were really meant to be where we were supposed to be. Our next gathering was when it was the week of the unmarking of the 215 children's graves at Kamloops residential school. And it was really heavy, but I think a lot of us were in a kind of trauma response, and we were all excited to be around each other, but we also got right down to work. And so none of us were really in a space to be able to talk about this. And then on our last day together, we finally gave space and we were able to do ceremony around that. And we were able to talk about the grief that all of us were carrying. and how it was affecting us in all different ways. And I think that was something that really solidified a lot of our connections and relationships to each other in this fellowship, because we're all dealing with it differently, and we're all facing and feeling our grief differently, and having that support within our fellowship was incredible. And so we can go to the next slide, please. Our next gathering was, it was on my traditional territory. We were able to go to Atlin, and we were able to spend a weekend on the land. We prioritized healing and self-care while also planning our next steps for our vision and for our engagement. We spent a good portion of this gathering working on fish. Taku River salmon was flown in, and elders and mentors such as my Aunt Sue helped and joined us and showed us how to fillet. We emerged from this gathering, or what was emerged from this gathering was the need to really slow down and really start focusing on our own mental health. And we started realizing how critical our own well-being and practicing spirituality and ceremony was really integral, was a real integral part of our whole well-being. And so one of our messages is like, how are we acknowledging our whole personhood, you know, our whole well-being, our physical and our mental well-being, and stuff like that. Among time on the land, working on fish, picking berries, telling stories, and resting, we planned for development of the Yukon First Nations Climate Vision and Action Plan, and further developed what approach we wanted to take with it. Next slide. Next slide. Through all of these times together and through all of these teaching over the last year, the approach to climate action that we came up with is that reconnection is climate action. We are fortunate to have the vision of together today for our children tomorrow. Part of our way here is to work together. We are making reconnection and vision and action plan for all Yukoners, not just for First Nations. After the summer, we rebranded ourselves as the Children of Tomorrow to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. In addition to this document we are creating, we are the plan. And so the outcome of the plan is basically us as the fellows, and the incredible transformation that we've been able to undergo only within a year of supporting each other and holding each other up and learning. I'll pass it back over to Jewel.
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. So through all our time together, the theory that we have come up with is that climate change is reconnection. And this comes from the idea that the dominant approaches we see now that are seen as climate action only treat the symptoms and not actually the root causes of climate change. Quick fixes are rooted in consumption, such as electric vehicles and solar panels, and they just don't go deep enough. We are living in an era of disconnection. Our current way of life is very imbalanced. The value of human emotion, hands-on doing on the land, and spiritual insight has been eliminated. The economic, legal, and governance systems we live and work within today were birthed from this disconnection. So to understand our theory that reconnection is climate action and that climate change is a symptom of disconnections from spirit, self, each other, community, and of earth, of our lands. I'll speak a little bit first to the heart of disconnection and where it lies within our systems, our governance system, our housing, food, extraction, economy, education, wellness, energy, and legal systems. And this is because these systems are rooted and built from Western and colonial worldviews that hold things such as individualism, hierarchy, authority, and human beings at the core of these systems and worldview. The disconnection is inherent to this worldview and therefore inherent to our systems. Our systems do not reflect our Indigenous and First Nations values such as community, culture, spirit, land, respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationships. And this leads to harmful effects not only on our people, but on our lands, as it's telling us through climate change. And disconnection can look and feel like always feeling busy, not feeling a sense of community, no time to rest, feeling guilty for taking time for yourself or doing nothing. Fences or property, not knowing what lands your food come from, not knowing how it's been treated or how it's been produced. You don't know where your clothes are coming from or how they've been made. Feeling like you have to say sorry for crying, and disconnection means enforcement and not education. And these are just a few examples of what we have come up with. So the heart of climate change actually lies within the disconnection that is within our systems. And this is the root of climate change and what we must focus taking action on and changing for our better future for our people and a better future for our lands. The unbalance in our lands is a reflection of the imbalance within ourselves. And we believe that learning, experiencing, and practicing Yukon First Nation culture will strengthen reconnection with spirit, self, each other, community, and our lands. Our First Nations culture still holds the umbilical connection we as humans, all humans, are supposed to share with Mother Earth, and we must follow our Indigenous leadership. What would our systems and community look like if we held our cultural values and worldview at the core of our systems? What would our lands and our lands' health look like? And I'll just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so as Shauna mentioned before, our climate and action vision plan is for all Yukoners, and it's not just for First Nations. We have come up with these tools of reconnection that are held in First Nations culture so we can transform the way that we learn, live, and work. The tools that we are talking about are language, art, humor, storytelling, ceremony, land, songs, dreams, and hands-on doing. Through cultural education that equips people with these tools of reconnection, we hope to guide people to become their best selves, their whole selves, so that they can transform how they make decisions that shape our society within systems such as wellness, housing, food, energy, extraction, governance, economy, and education. Each of us has a different pathway to reconnection. For some, it's through language revitalization. For others, it's through beating or time on the land. But regardless of what it is, like Shauna mentioned before, the outcome of our fellowship will not be just the plan, like the actual document. It will be us as people and our journeys and how we will continue and move that forward and share our ideas with others. And move on to the next slide. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jewel. So next steps. From May to December, our engagement plan is to explore our reconnection is climate action philosophy and our vision for tomorrow with a Yukon First Nations working group. Community members and knowledge holders through virtual workshops and attendance of community events, research, and chats over several cups of tea. From December to January, we plan to bring together our engagement learnings and finalize our reconnection vision and action plan. In February next year, we will ratify the vision and action plan and in alignment with the 50th anniversary of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. Exciting stuff. And you can go to the next slide. And this is our beautiful logo that was created by our fellow Carissa Wah, aka Wah. And you can see there's the orange in the bottom right corner is to represent the 250 children. And every other in-person gathering that we had after that, it kind of aligned with all of the other schools kind of coming out with their findings also. And so it was really powerful for us to be together during this year, especially during those times of the new news releases. Above that, you can see the Northern Lights and also the soap berries. Some of our fellows went and picked soap berries in our Atlan gathering, and we were able to make soap berry ice cream. And as I mentioned before, we have a swan. Carissa also wanted to incorporate the 4 colors of the medicine wheel. On the bottom left, you can see a spider web. One of our fellows, Matsa Sanama, told us a story of a Southern Shoshone story of the word, this story behind the word spider net and how it correlates, spider web and fishnet correlate together. And a man being able to watch a spider making his web was able to give that man the idea to make a fishnet, in which he was able to save himself. And above that, you can also see a salmon. And so caribou and salmon are a really big part of all of our fellows, all of our journeys, and we all connect to it. And so that is all we have. Ganesh Chish.
Ganesh Chish.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much to Jewel and Shauna for sharing these stories and for sharing Jared's beautiful video. I'll be sure to share your presentation with my teenage daughter. I think she'll just be inspired by what you've all talked about. And it's really important in my mind that we give a lot of space to youth, especially as they take the baton forward on climate action and protecting the lands and environments in which you live. I hope that we can continue supporting and upholding you as you are all reconnecting and moving forward on this really, really important journey. So thank you, both of you, so much. Now we are going to move to the Atlantic coast. So we're going to hear from Mitch Downton. Mitch, would you like to introduce yourself? And we look forward to hearing your presentation on climate change and adaptation in the Atlantic. Welcome, Mitch.
For sure. Thanks, Roberta. And thanks, Jewel and Shauna, for that wonderful presentation. I really appreciated that. So hello, everyone. My name is Mitch Downton, currently speaking to you today from the ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq people in sunny Halifax, Nova Scotia today. I'm the policy analyst for climate change with the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs Secretariat. I've been with this organization for 4 years now in 3 different capacities, but always with a focus on climate change in the environment. And I'd say I'm passionate about Indigenous, environmental and energy issues, specifically surrounding climate change and the clean energy transition. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'm going to get into my presentation. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. I know we've all been doing this Zoom thing for a couple of years and I still almost have trouble sharing my screen, but I think I got it. So appreciate that. So yes, so thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. So I'm gonna be talking to you about First Nation climate change adaptation in Atlantic perspective. So I'll start off with providing information about the organization I work for and then a little bit about the work that I do. So as I mentioned, I work for the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs Secretariat. It's probably maybe even Canada, but I'm willing to be fact checked on that one. So we advise 33 Atlantic First Nation communities. And to do so, we have different policy departments, including health, housing and infrastructure, the Atlantic Indigenous Economic Development Integrated Research Program, so we call that ADIRP. And where I fit in is fisheries and integrated resources. So my role is the policy analyst for climate change. So essentially, I review federal and provincial policies to observe potential impacts to Atlantic First Nation communities from a climate change and decarbonization lens. I created and I actively facilitate the Atlantic First Nation Climate Change Advisory Committee. So this is where we have First Nation climate leaders from across the Atlantic virtually meet to discuss climate priorities within the region, and hopefully we'll be able to meet in person soon. I'll be looking forward to that. And lastly, oversee climate change research projects and events that help to benefit our represented communities. So essentially I do three things. I do policy analysis, facilitate a climate change leadership committee, and plan research and events for our community members. And so I want to focus on the committee and the projects and events, as I think those are the most relevant topics to this panel discussion today. So we'll start off with the Atlantic First Nation Climate Change Advisory Committee. Part of working with APC is demonstrating an affinity for very long titles. So yes, moving on, the goals of the committee. So essentially, we want First Nation, oh, sorry, I think okay, I'm back. Yes, so we want First Nation climate leaders from different parts of the Atlantic gathering together to understand what is being done in the region from a climate change adaptation and mitigation perspective. So essentially, APC is a regional organization. And so we represent communities in all of the Atlantic provinces. So Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, and we do represent some communities in the Gaspé region in Quebec as well. So that's a lot of distinct regional geography. And as such, our communities across the Atlantic, well, they're all dealing with their own specific and important issues regarding climate change because of that. As an example, a community like Lennox Island and Prince Edward Island, who are literally losing their home due to coastal erosion, well, they're going to have different priorities than a community organization would up in Labrador, or communities on the Bredor Lakes in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, for example. So we really wanted to give a space for these climate leaders who are tackling their community's issues to share lessons, see how they would like APC as a regional organization to help, and brainstorm regional goals that the members' organizations and community members would have. So regional organizations, I've mentioned we advise community members and community organizations. So I'd really like to highlight these groups. And I'm going to focus on certain community organizations, and they're known as AROMs, Aboriginal Aquatic Resource and Ocean Management Organizations. Again, very long title. So APC as a body, we mainly work on the policy side, while the AROMs do significant work on the technical side. So these organizations, they're the ones doing the on-the-ground climate adaptation work. They're doing the research, and they're doing the projects that are so vital for their communities. And as such, some of the members actually on the First Nation Climate Change Advisory Committee, well, they're AROM directors or AROM representatives. There are a total of 10 AROMs in the Atlantic, and they all work for the represented communities, as mentioned. And if you'd like to know more, we have more information on our website that has links to each specific AROM and the work they're doing. And I can show that link at the end of my presentation. So going forward, each organization is conducting fantastic work to adapt to climate change specific to their own region and communities. So part of my role from a policy and advocacy side is to ensure that these organizations are supported to the best extent they can be. We want to make sure that we find out about federal funding dollars and let these groups know so that they can take that money and utilize it for their work. We want to get the money out of Ottawa and down to the regions and down to our communities. And these groups are doing such great work. I have to shout them out every chance I can get because it is really something else. So just some quick examples so you can kind of get the scope of some of the climate adaptation work. There's one AROM known as the Mi'kmaq Conservation Group. They focus primarily on the communities in mainland Nova Scotia. They're working on solar panel initiatives. They have a plant pollinator project. They're conducting cost-benefit analyses for their communities in terms of knowing whether certain climate change adaptation or renewable projects are worthwhile. They're focusing on knowledge transfer of land-based education between elders and youth, and they're creating climate toolkits so communities can really do their own weather monitoring as well. And there's other AROMs doing other work. Apologies if I don't pronounce this one correctly. Nunatukavut Community Council, or NCC. Well, they're working on youth engagement to train youth to measure ice thickness in shifting travel routes across Labrador. The Guest-Bagawag Mi'kmaq Resource Council, GMRC. As I mentioned, we have some communities in Gaspé region of Quebec, and this GMRC is located in that region. Well, they're conducting a lot of research on salmon temperature monitoring. They're using infrared cameras to do so. Maliseet Nations Conservation Council, MNCC, conducting a lot of cold water species research, and they're tracking water quality in the Willistic River, for those that don't know, the St. John River. The Mi'kmaq Confederacy of Prince Edward Island, I had mentioned Lennox Island before, so coastal erosion, huge issue for their communities. So they've really used drones and LiDAR GIS technology to kind of track and map all of their coastlines in order to better help them in their coastal erosion adaptation work. And there are, of course, more AROMs conducting more great work, but for the sake of time, I'll just keep it here. And so when we say First Nations or climate leaders, this is what we mean. These communities have contributed the least amount of emissions, but they're conducting the most significant and vital work, at least in the Atlantic here. So moving off from what our regional partners are doing and more towards what APC as a body is doing. As mentioned previously, another part of my work, organizing events, research, and reports that could really benefit our community members. And so I've listed a couple of just recent reports and events and research here. So the first, observations on climate change adaptation in Atlantic Canada. This one was aided by the help of retired environmental consultant named Anne Wilkie. And we wanted to have the goal of being a reference to key resources on climate change adaptation. We wanted to provide a practical reference for Atlantic First Nation communities that are working on climate adaptation. So there's a lot of online resources, databases, and tools that are mentioned, and the links are provided in this report for really easy access. The second, the Fisheries and Climate Change Adaptation report. This was aided by a local company called Generation Z Research, and they conducted a literature review, and also they conducted interviews with Atlantic First Nation fishers to observe their thoughts on climate change's impact to the fisheries and where they see that future going. And both of these reports, they're available on our website. Again, I'll have that link at the presentation. So the third bullet there, the virtual climate change youth career gathering. Well, that one was quite recent, actually. We just hosted our last one in late February of this year. We wanted to reach out to youth and create a space where they could come to get more information about working in climate change or attending school in a climate change or First Nation focused program. And so we've kind of set these two virtual gatherings up to kind of really help us do that. So we had First Nation professionals talk to their experiences working surrounding climate change issues. And actually the presenter following me, Graeme Reed, he was one of our presenters, and he spoke about his experiences at the COP meeting in Scotland last year. We also had professors and academics in Atlantic universities speak to programs that their universities are offering that really prioritize climate change and prioritize First Nation lands. And lastly, we also had local elders talking to their own experiences on the land and imparting wisdom on the youth as well. And we will have a summary report of those gatherings up on our website as well. All right, so some future climate work. So later on in the panel, you'll hear from Graeme and Patricia. Their great work on their national and their provincial climate change strategy. So in the Atlantic, ours is just in the beginning stage right now. We unfortunately had to postpone a bit because of COVID. But we had completed a climate change survey back in 2020 to gather community members' feedback on climate change adaptation in their communities. And so moving forward, I want to visit all of our communities and really engage with them in person, something I couldn't really do with COVID, but also continue to meet with the Climate Change Advisory Committee. And these sessions will inform, hopefully, will inform an Atlantic strategy. It seeks to evaluate the participation of our communities in climate change and climate change adaptation projects. And this will be used to identify relevant gaps in federal and provincial funding for some of these projects as well. And any strategy that we produce will have to involve the AROMs, as again, they're the ones doing such great work on the ground. So that's it. That's all I got for now. Thanks for listening. If you have any more questions or suggestions, or just want to shoot me an email at any time, that's my email right there. And that is the link to our fisheries section on our website, as promised. Thanks a lot for listening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of all of us when I say how much I appreciate hearing the perspectives from the East Coast and the good work that's happening there. In particular, you know, that you brought up issues that we need to address related to climate change and adaptation, and how different regions are doing different work in that area. So really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So now we're going to hear about the national picture through Graeme Reed, sorry. Graeme, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And I'm sure everybody else, including myself, is eager to hear about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, miigwech, Roberta, and miigwech to Mitch, Shauna, and Joel for setting the foundation for this really important conversation. And hopefully, you know, I'm just noting the time, so I'll try to do this relatively quickly and focus on the kind of specific value add that the AFN is doing. So Anin Bojo, Graeme Reed, Indigenous, Makwa Dodem, Ottawa, Nonchaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. It's an honor to join all of you in this virtual space. I'm joining from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver, and want to lift up, you know, my responsibilities as a guest in these lands, an uninvited guest. I originally grew up in Ottawa. I have English and Scottish heritage on my dad's side, and on my mom's German and Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, specifically from Wacomico and Thessalon, actually. And I've been at the AFN for the National Office for the last 6 years or so, and have been, you know, part of the team advancing our national climate strategy. And so wanted to share that with you. Also want to acknowledge that we seem to be having a lot of PowerPoints just in this nature. So I'll try to kind of focus my discussion on the kind of elements that I think really build on the incredible contributions that our previous speakers have shared. And going to skip the first couple of slides because I think there are a few things that were important, but one thing that I think is worth reiterating and why, you know, we find this conversation so important and why we're so grateful for the National Collaborating Center to host us is really about aligning these intersecting crises that seem to be facing us, and only through that alignment can we really understand what is the kind of root cause driving that. And I really, you know, want to lift up the work of the climate fellows and the conversation that Shauna and Joel brought, because of the way in which they articulate those human values and behaviors that are really driving all of these different things. And I think it's important, you know, in our conversation to kind of move past the overemphasis on technology and markets and science, many of the things that have created some of the very real problems that we're facing, to focus on, climate as a people-based issue and on a human value and behavior. And that, I think, centralizes, self and what are the actions that we can take, but also what are the ways in which the structures and the system in which we occupy, perpetuate those behaviors that are driving those issues. So on this slide, we talk about those intersecting climate, biodiversity, and obviously the health crisis, and hopefully, to the extent possible, all of you are keeping safe and healthy in these very bizarre times that really speak to our ongoing imbalanced relationship. I wanted to focus, maybe I'll skip this. What I wanted to share in the federal context is there is a lot going on, not a lot necessarily from the perspective that was shared today, both by Mitch, Jewel, and Shauna, which in my mind speaks to the kind of value add conversation that we're seeking to have and seeking to advance through the work that all 4 of our organizations are doing currently. And so the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, as a national representative body for First Nations across the country, 634 chiefs and councils that are represented in our biannual meetings. We have one in December, one in July, and as part of that, the Chiefs and Assembly pass resolutions. Those resolutions mark the direction that the Secretariat, which is where I work, kind of advances progress. And I wanted to share here just a wide range of different mandates that we've had even over the last couple of years, but then going back much longer, and wanted to focus on the declaration of the First Nations climate emergency, which really is a nice way to connect the work that actually is being led in the Yukon with the chief from the Vantakwitchin and many other Yukon First Nations on the declaration of a climate emergency from Vantakwitchin territory that was then brought to the Assembly in Fredericton in 2019, declaring a First Nations climate emergency. And really the point, among other pieces, is that stress that climate change constitutes the state of emergency, not only for ourselves as humans, but also for our lands, waters, animals. And we've heard also our medicines and our culture and our relationship with the land, which, I think epitomizes the difference in which, we arrive at that conversation. Also part of that mandate was the hosting of an AFN National Climate Gathering up in Ta'an and Kwanlin-Dun territory. In the chat, I'll pop in just the kind of differing resources that we've developed as a result of that. We have a gathering report. We also have a gathering overview video that really kind of shows the approach that was taken in that conversation and how it informed, the design, the conversations, and also the actions afterwards. Part of that is the advancement and organization of a concept that we're kind of framing as a First Nations climate lens. And this First Nations climate lens, now there is a circle that is missing in this, and we just need to add it. The overarching circle being natural or spiritual law, depending on how you acknowledge that, but really as that governing relationship between ourselves and creation. Next, we have the kind of context that's inclusive of the legislative, legal, and policy ecosystem, which aligns with the minimum standards contained within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the calls for justice from the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the truth and reconciliation calls to action, all of which the constitutional jurisprudence at the Supreme Court really kind of frame out the space in which we start to get the solutions. We want to review and analyze climate solutions based on this lens, based on the understanding of the decades of work that has been done to unshackle the legacy of colonization that seems to be present currently. And I think, Mitch shared an example of Lennox Island as an example of that, compared to, just down the street in Richmond and the sea levees that are being developed and created there. The second circle is really on this First Nations lived reality, that structural legacy of colonization. And, I think Jewel and Shauna and the fellows and even Jocelyn really articulated that place of disconnection, which, comes from structures that were imposed on First Nations through the colonial government. And it's important to acknowledge that as a basis for how do we avoid the tendency to engage in climate conversations that are privileged, that are focused on, being disconnected from those tenets of, reconnection, but also just like basic services. We're talking about, housing on reserve, drinking water, wastewater, obviously addressing the other crises that are facing our communities as well. And so really important to acknowledge that. And then finally, the First Nations worldview. And I think the video that Jared put together really articulates that. So it's really, how do we bring all of those concentric circles together into focus to then, explore what are First Nations led solutions, and how do we articulate those? And we heard, language revitalization and cultural revitalization and efforts in food sovereignty, all of which are central to this. And we've also, we've started really applying this lens as kind of a policy lens to the different conversations that Canada is engaging in. And we're also starting to share videos that communicate that. So I put that video in the chat. Hopefully you don't watch it now, but soon after the presentation here, which is just a further articulation of that. So as mentioned, the continuation of that resolution from the Chiefs in Assembly was the National Climate Strategy. So we hosted a national climate gathering, and we're also developing a national climate strategy. And as part of that national climate strategy, unfortunately, the reality of COVID happened, but we were able to host a series of webinars. We hosted 2 surveys that we've garnered a lot of support. We've worked through a internal to AFN committee, as well as our Chiefs Committee, the Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment, which has chiefs and technicians from all 11 regions. And now we're talking about, like, based on those conversations, how do we identify the broad operational pillars of the strategy, and then have more in-depth conversations on the objectives and actions. And the beginning of those conversations are articulated in kind of 7 broad areas. The importance of First Nations jurisdiction, right to self-determination as central to the conversation, the need to support First Nations capacity, both technical and financial, as climate and conservation leaders, that nexus between self-sufficiency, sovereignty and economies, food, water, and energy as central. The prioritization of Indigenous knowledge systems, language, youth, culture, and spirituality, which, I think was, not to keep referring to this, but is such an incredible presentation by the climate fellows, the closing of this natural and built infrastructure gap, the equipping and supporting of First Nations in managing emergencies that we know are unfortunately only going to increase. And, being located in BC for the last several years, have really experienced the different, fires, floods, heat, and storms that are only going to increase if we don't address these root causes driving the problems that we're facing. And then finally, how do we use this climate lens to reform legislation, policy, and programs? How do we do it in such a way that we can, deconstruct those assumptions? And Jewel kind of, I think, articulated some of the inherent assumptions in the way in which we structure climate policies and climate conversations. Are we going to replace our 30 million combustion engines with really 30 million EVs. Is that the future that we necessarily want? And do we want to invest in, you know, equitable and affordable public transport, noting that obviously, like Mitch indicated, those solutions depend highly on the area that you're engaged in. So how do we, you know, bring the climate conversation in such a way that, and one of the central teachings that we kind of guide our work in is this grass dancer teaching at the national level. How are we, the teaching goes, you know, the grass dancers are intended to create the place for ceremony. And how do we as the AFN, as a national office, create the place for ceremony that First Nations can enter themselves and self-determine their own solutions? And so really this is just the intersection of all of these different areas that I framed out. And how do we get to the place where, you know, climate solutions are inherently land and place-based, and what is the, you know, role that we have in connecting these things from the national all the way to the local, and how do we continue to uplift the incredible work that was shared and highlighted by our previous speakers. And so finally, just to close, I wanted just to share, you know, our path forward. So we will have additional, as I mentioned, working sessions with the ACE. We have our annual General Assembly in July. We have a second National Climate Gathering that all of you are invited to. It's taking place in Fredericton, actually at the end of September, the 27th to 29th. To the earlier point, and I think Shauna talked about the reconnection vision, but our national climate strategy started in Fredericton, is going back to Fredericton for that national climate gathering. And so hopefully we can also maintain the circularity in that conversation. And then hopefully we'll be ready by December to present the climate strategy back to the Chiefs in Assembly. And so not wanting to take additional time, I think Patricia is going to share, you know, concretely how BC First Nations are advancing this conversation, but wanted to say miigwech to everybody for the space, and really look forward to any of the conversations that we can have as part of this.
Thank you so much, Graeme. I just want to say how important it is for us to hear about the work that's happening at the national level, and that has yet to happen as well. And I really appreciate how you made the interconnections and interconnection with drivers, and you know, what we need to look at if we're going to be addressing climate change in a meaningful way. You know, how the work that you're doing really informs the health and well-being of First Nations. So I really want to commend you for the work that you're doing. So now let's move on to the BC region and hear from Patricia Rojas. Before we do that, I just want to encourage people, if they do have questions, to put them in the Q&A. We should have maybe 15 minutes at the end of this session to ask and have that conversation with some of the presenters. So Patricia, if you could just share a bit about yourself, and we're really excited to hear about what's happening in your region.
Thank you, Roberta, and good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Rojas. It's an honor to be here with you this morning, afternoon for the East. I work as the Regional Climate Change Coordinator for the BC Assembly of First Nations. I am originally from Cajamarca. It's a place located in the Andes of Peru. I moved from there a few years ago. And I just want to say thank you also to the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, and to Roberta for inviting me to share our work on the development of the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan today. So I want to start my presentation by acknowledging this beautiful land. It's sunny today, which is great, where I am lucky to live and work. This is the ancestral and unceded land of the Hulk people, also known as Williams Lake First Nations. So about the strategy, in 2019, the First Nations Leadership Council received a mandate from Chiefs in Assembly to prepare a draft climate change and action plan for First Nations in BC. So for those who are not familiar with BC organizations, the First Nations Leadership Council, known as the FNLC, is a political organization composed of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the First Nations Summit, and the BC Assembly of First Nations. The three organizations work together on several topics, such as climate change, to advocate for First Nation rights and interests in BC. We have 204 First Nations communities here. So why a First Nations climate strategy? Because First Nations in BC recognize what elders, knowledge keepers, and Western science have been saying, that the world is changing and we are in a climate crisis whose impacts will be more severe and frequent. We are also in an environmental and biodiversity crisis that impacts the land, water, and ecosystems and threatens the food security and cultures of First Nations. So those are some of the reasons. There are also 204 diverse First Nations in BC, most living on unceded territories, who hold inherent rights, title, and treaty rights, and who have to face the legacy of colonization, which includes economic inequities, injustice, racism, violence, and many other things. However, First Nations in BC are also climate champions, and through their self-determined climate projects are leading the climate response in the province. There are many projects that's almost impossible to track in all the topics that climate change touch. We also need a climate strategy, a First Nations climate strategy, because First Nations in BC also wanted a First Nations focus climate strategy, because the Crown government or the Crown's government's climate plans or legislation were developed without a meaningful participation of First Nations in BC. We are also in a context where Indigenous rights have been recognized. In 2019, British Columbia passed a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act to implement the UN Declaration in BC. And in 2021, Canada also passed a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act. These laws are one step more towards justice, but that doesn't mean that everything on the ground changed with the passing of those laws. So the strategy aims to bring more changes. So going back to the climate resolutions, Chiefs in BC mandated the FNLC to prepare a First Nations climate strategy and action plan that aligns with the United Nations recommendations on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, ensure that First Nations inherent title rights and treaty rights are protected and asserted when addressing climate change, incorporates First Nations knowledge and worldviews in the climate response. So this strategy is a province-wide in scope, seeking to respond to the needs and priorities of First Nations in BC as a collective body. It is a living document, and the idea is that it will be edited and updated based on First Nations leadership mandates. And this strategy also respects the diversity and self-determination of First Nations in the province, who are invited to use the strategy as a foundation to guide their own climate actions based on their unique needs, priorities, and processes. As I said, there are many examples of climate actions from First Nations here in BC. So the strategy was prepared in 4 phases. We started in 2019 with a province-wide survey, but it wasn't until the end of 2020 that we secured funding support from the BC government to start the development of the strategy. It was completed and endorsed in the respective FNLC assemblies this year in February and March. So during these 4 phases, the FNLC coordinated and facilitated different venues to develop the strategy with First Nations. It was challenging because the COVID-19 pandemic made us switch our in-person regional meetings for virtual meetings, and it's not the same. Yeah, conversations in a virtual space is not exactly the same when it's in person, especially when we are touching those topics that bring many issues from nations. So it was hard. But it was in 2021 when also communities were hit by many catastrophic climate-related disasters that impacted everyone in BC, but particularly First Nations communities. And the discovery of unmarked graves of First Nations children that didn't return home also play a role in how the development of the strategy unfold. The strategy development was guided by the First Nations Climate Action Technical Advisory Group. Those are the names of the members of this advisory group. This was a diverse and intergenerational advisory group. It has representation from different BC regions with multiple backgrounds and knowledge and experience. This group of experts play a fundamental role to define the structure of the strategy. So in 2021, we organized many activities to support the development of the strategy, including many engagement sessions with right holders, a youth session presenting the draft of the strategy at the FNLC assemblies. We also held individual meetings with interested communities and First Nations organizations, and we also sent a questionnaire to First Nations organizations to engage in the strategy development. There are many First Nations organizations in BC as well. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. So the strategy has a vision, guiding principles, and 4 pathways that you can see on the screen. The vision is we, the first people of the lands, assert our inherent title, rights, and jurisdiction to lead the response to the climate crisis. We exercise our knowledge, laws, and processes in our self-determined ways to care for the earth and ensure health and stability for generations to come. In the strategy, you can also find vision statements for First Nations youth from the coastal, north, and interior regions. The guiding principles are self-determination and self-government, culture and tradition, guardianship and stewardship, collaboration and partnership, empowerment, leadership, and self-sufficiency. The strategy has 4 pathways: inherent title and rights, capacity and leadership, land and water protection, and climate response and preparedness. Together, these pathways make this strategy different from Crown government's strategies. Those pathways are interconnected and interrelated. They try to reflect the First Nations climate lens that Graeme described. The first pathway, inherent title and rights, is the foundational pillar and enables the other pathways. Its goal is to ensure First Nations inherent title rights and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed in climate planning and response. So the second pathway is capacity and leadership and reflects how crucial it It is to support and build capacity in First Nations governments and members in order to prepare for the impacts and uncertainty of global warming. So the pathway 3 is land and water protection, outlines strategic actions to help protect the land and waters, which are essential for supporting life and particularly for First Nations cultural survival. Actions are also focused on environmental stewardship while also ensuring that First Nations CBC are enabled to uphold their responsibilities and obligations to the land, water, and resources. Pathway 4, climate response and preparedness, contains the actions to help First Nations get prepared to live in a world with a changing climate and to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to be in line with IPCC recommendations of keeping global warming 1.5 below 1.5 degrees. In the end, this pathway aims to support First Nations self-determined initiatives grounded in their specific priorities. So with each goal, there are a set of themes and their respective objectives, strategies, and actions. The themes, objectives, actions represents the climate priorities discussed and shared by First Nations in engagement process. In total, the strategy has 23 themes and 143 strategic actions. It's a very robust strategy. There are actions that are province-wide in scope and others that are community-based, which are only suggestions for First Nations governments, because the strategy, as I said before, recognizes the diversity, autonomy, and self-determination of First Nations in BC. The strategy also make notice that the difference between each community and based on the distinct and unique context of overall experience and risk for climate change that they experience. So the strategy also summarized the themes and actions into 20 urgent calls for climate action. I'm not going to go through the 20 calls, 20 actions because of the time, but just to mention a few of them. The strategical calls for the review and reforms of climate legislation, policies, regulations, programs, and engagement frameworks. The strategy also calls for building long-term climate capacity with First Nations communities and strengthening the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge in climate policies and responses, and empowering First Nations youth. It's also important. The strategy also calls for strengthening efforts to restore and conserve critical wildlife habitats, transform resource extraction frameworks to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is obtained from First Nations when a project starts, conduct a province-wide First Nations infrastructure assessment to identify and meet infrastructure needs to adapt to climate impacts, support First Nations in assessing, quantifying, and reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. A few more here. Immediately strengthen emergency management responses and recovery systems within First Nations communities, and support community-based climate strategy as well, and support First Nations in developing environmental, sustainable, and low carbon economy projects, which is also important, and immediately ensure that all First Nations in BC have long-term and reliable access to clean and safe food and water resources. So those are some of the actions, some of the 20 urgent calls for climate action. And I think that's it from me, and thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer if there is any questions. Thanks.
Many, many thanks, Patricia, for highlighting the work that's being spearheaded in your region, and in particular issues and concerns that for us are really important to hear about. I'm actually really happy to hear that there are so many climate change champions in your region. That fills me with a lot of hope. And in fact, all of the presentations that I've heard today give me hope that self-determined, land-focused strategies grounded in Indigenous knowledges are underway that'll guide and strengthen First Nations to be able to respond to a rapidly changing climate. So we do have about 12 minutes for questions. I know that some have come in outside of the Q&A box. And maybe I'll turn to Donna to ask the first one. And if you do want to ask specific questions that following the presentation today, you can also direct them to Graeme at the AFN. So Donna, I'll open it up to you.
Great, thank you so much, Roberta, and thanks to all the presenters. That was just wonderful, wonderful source of information. So we know that climate change research is not keeping up with what is happening on the ground for First Nations living on reserve and off reserve. So I'm just wondering what some of the knowledge gaps that you see in your work where you think that more research is needed. And I'm wondering, maybe Graeme, if we could start with you.
Yeah, definitely. And just, I think, want to reiterate to Roberta's point, just the important conversation that we had today, and really excited that that we were, we had the ability to take this space and do that. I guess I would kind of describe a few things with respect to research. Like, one, I think the time really that we're in currently is about how do we empower Indigenous-led research, and how do we do it in such a way that we kind of unpack the challenging assumptions that research exists within our communities. Linda Smith always talks about research as a really dirty word, right? And in actuality, and I think Shauna kind of articulated this in the video, like, if anything, First Nations are the first researchers, being those who are in close relationship with the land itself, right? And so wanted to acknowledge that kind of first in terms of unpacking these terms. I guess in my mind, there's like a few pieces. There's research that can be done that's Indigenous led on the kind of conceptual theoretical level, which is to say, how do we unpack some of the assumptions that climate discourse just perpetuates, right? And the terms that are used to do that, whether we talk about the current fixation on the concept of net zero and the implications of what net zero is, whether we talk about, for example, the emerging concept of nature-based solutions, right? And unpacking, I think we heard the assumptions around differentiating humans to nature. How do we unpack, some of the kind of discourses around, the green and fair and just transition, all of which in my mind are kind of conceptual reviews that First Nations can lead. And then there's really practical stuff, right? Like whether it's about the creation and establishment of First Nations led monitoring and assessment programs. How do we support, action-oriented research that uplifts the language and cultural revitalization that's occurring across the country? How do we, make space for, gender dimensions within climate policy? How do we also, and to the National Center, Collaborating Center, did that really constructive chapter as part of the National Climate Assessment on Indigenous peoples and health and well-being, and how do we, articulate that sort of approach within, the spaces that we're creating. And then I'll finally just say, the last thing that I think is useful is really about the kind of connection between Indigenous law, governance, and self-determination within climate, and how do we articulate that in a concrete way. And I will say, as part of that National Climate Assessment, a few years ago, we negotiated the creation of an Indigenous, we're calling it for our future Indigenous Resilience Report, which is like an Indigenous standalone report as part of that assessment process that, I think will articulate some of these gaps and opportunities in the way that, was communicated by all of our presenters here together.
Great, thank you, Graeme. Were there any other speakers that would like to just comment on that?
Sure, I could just add on a little bit, I think. I think we've tried to do some okay research with APC, and as Graeme said, this was really just by prioritizing First Nation voices. But I think a lot of Western research typically hasn't caught up with the lived experiences of what First Nation communities are really dealing with day to day on a climate level. And so I think we really need to keep prioritizing First Nation voices and creating that capacity so that communities can really tell their own stories and document their own research forward. So that's what I have.
Thanks, Mitch. Okay, anyone else like to just comment on that? Okay, all right, moving on. We just have one more question come in. So just maybe if maybe again, Graeme, if you could start and we could open it up to the other speakers, but why are distinctions-based approaches to climate change so important in Canada's national plan? I know that the AFN sits at a distinctions-based table, but why is that so important for people to understand why that needs to happen that way?
Yeah, and I'll start, and I feel like, if anything, part of setting up the webinar in this way is to articulate that. And I guess I would do this in two levels. First, there's the conventional distinctions based, which is, just separating the lived realities, histories, and cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which is important. All of us, those three groups have very different histories, cultures, languages, areas of kind of ancestral occupation. But I think it's even more relevant in this conversation to consider First Nations on a distinctions-based approach. And we've heard a little bit about, the reality of First Nations living in what's currently BC, Yukon First Nations, and those on the Atlantic coast as well, all of which have very different histories, cultures, languages, similar experiences, and we've kind of heard the thread between all of them. But it's really important to acknowledge that land-based and place-based specificity in the way in which these things are communicated. And I think really it comes back to that point that Jewel and Shauna raised about, a land-first framing necessitates a place-based or distinctions-based approach because of the kind of specificities geographically.
Thanks for that. Did anyone else want to comment on that?
I can comment. Yeah. Our strategy, I think that was central for our strategy because, first is this strategy for First Nations. It doesn't include Métis. We don't have Inuit here, but doesn't include Métis people. And the other side is, as Graeme said, all the communities are not the same. We have many different languages here in BC. We have 204 First Nations communities, but they are not coming from the same family. Also the climate impacts that are experiencing are different between the north, the interior, and the coastal. So the idea with the strategy is to provide that space and recognize that all the diversity between the nations. I think what happened with government plans and policies and legislation is trying to put everything in the same pot, and that's not the case for First Nations in BC.
Thank you. All right. We do have one person that would like to ask questions, but by video. Not sure that we can enable video. So Dan, are you able to put your question in the chat? Okay, well, while we're maybe waiting for Dan to do that, I'll just hand it over to Roberta.
Yeah, maybe we could just put up the, oh wait, let's see.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should, so from Denise Webb, she'd like to I have learned a lot this afternoon. I'm wondering if speakers can speak to any youth-led initiatives going on in the Atlantic region, especially anything related to the great work going on in the Yukon discussed today. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Denise. Yeah, as I had mentioned, we had just done a couple of youth climate change gatherings. I think those got really great feedback, and so hopefully we'll continue to have those in the future. And so from a regional APC perspective, that's one thing that we'd like to continue to do. And so we can definitely keep folks in the loop on when that's going to happen. But yeah, Shauna and Jewel, they gave their presentation was fabulous in terms of their youth engagement. I'm taking lessons from them on this presentation as well. So we'll continue to go forward with that. But yeah, thanks for that point. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. And we do have Dan was able to type the question in the chat here. I'd like to know about traditional ecological knowledge and how this fits into climate action. Did we have anyone that wanted to try and tackle that question?
Maybe we could ask Shauna or Jewel if they could comment on that, given that their work on the land and how that relates to climate action.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to say thanks to Mitch for your comments there. But yeah, I would say it has everything to do with climate action. It's what we're basing our initiative off of, is our elders' lived knowledge, lived experience, that they are the ones, not only them, but our families have been out on the lands for hundreds of thousands of years, and they've been able to experience and live the patterns, and they know the land is so connectedly, I believe. So I think that it fits into every aspect of our climate actions, for sure. Shauna, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, Jewel, I think you really summarized that perfectly. I think the only thing I would add on to that too is when working with youth and younger generations, I think it's really important to emphasize that traditional knowledge isn't something that's really super achievable. It's not something to really it's not something like a checkbox that you get to. It's like a lived experience. It's a way of thinking and seeing and relating to the world around you. And so it's almost like, living that traditional knowledge and just living our different ways of life is, I think that kind of gets back to our reconnection philosophy also. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say that also our elders have been in this relationship with the land and balance with the land and have been able to keep it healthy, and not only healthy, but flourishing for hundreds of thousands of years, and have sustained this life cycle, which I believe is what we are trying to achieve, is to kind of get back to that balance, get back to those traditional protocols that allowed for us to take care of the land and allowed for reciprocal relationships and responsibility and respect. So yeah, but thank you for your question, Dan.
Thanks, and maybe I'll have Donna just put up the last two slides just for information for the attendees. So I just want to say we do have the Assembly of First Nations National Climate Gathering Report, Driving Change Leading to Solutions, and as well the National Collaborating Center released in 2022, a chapter within the health of Canadians in a changing climate, where we look specifically at Indigenous peoples' health and climate change. And if we just go to the last slide, I want to say that on behalf of the National Collaborating Center, I want to thank all of the speakers today for your presentations and the conversation that has provided us with greater knowledge on the work that's underway at the national and regional offices of the Assembly of First Nations. As well, we'd be remiss if we didn't extend our thanks to Graeme and the Assembly of First Nations who worked with us today to organize this webinar. So I want to say thank you to everybody again who attended today's webinar, and we hope that you have a wonderful and restful rest of your day. Thank you.